In the early years of the 16th century, England was a kingdom poised between tradition and transformation. The Catholic Church governed nearly every aspect of life, and the monarchy stood as both political and divine authority. At the heart of this ancient order emerged a woman who would challenge both church and crown. Her name was Anne Boleyn. Anne was born around 1501 to Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, members of ambitious noble families. Though not royalty, her lineage was impressive enough to grant her access to elite circles. Her early years were spent in the Netherlands and France, where she was educated in the courts of Margaret of Austria and Queen Claude. These experiences shaped Anne into something rare and powerful, a woman of intelligence, elegance, and sharp political instinct. By the time Anne returned to England in her early 20s, she had become a force of charisma and sophistication. Her fashion, her manners, and most importantly, her wit, set her apart from the typical English noblewoman. She was fluent in French, well-read in poetry, theology, and politics, and unafraid to speak her mind. These traits caught the attention of many, but one man in particular would change the course of her life and England's history: King Henry VIII. Henry VIII was, at the time, in the midst of a troubled marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Their union had produced only one surviving child, Mary. But Henry's deepest desire was a male heir. Catherine, having suffered multiple miscarriages and stillbirths, was no longer the young queen she once was. Henry began to despair of ever having a son, and that despair made him vulnerable. Anne first caught Henry's eye around 1525, not long after her sister Mary Boleyn had served as the king's mistress. But unlike Mary, Anne would not be seduced by royal attention alone. She refused Henry's advances, turning him down again and again. It was an audacious act, especially in a court where a monarch's will was law. But that very resistance only inflamed Henry's obsession. Anne knew what she was doing. She played a dangerous game, but it was calculated. She did not want to be a mistress, she wanted to be queen. And Henry, entranced by her boldness, began to consider the unthinkable. He would seek an annulment from Catherine. He would marry Anne. He would change the course of the monarchy itself. The path to their union was anything but simple. The Pope refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine, citing religious and political reasons. Catherine was, after all, the aunt of Emperor Charles V, one of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Defying him risked war and excommunication. But Henry was relentless, and Anne, ever persuasive, urged him to challenge Rome's authority. It was during this struggle that Anne's influence grew to unprecedented levels. She surrounded herself with reformist thinkers who questioned the Catholic Church. She encouraged Henry to read works by William Tyndale and other early Protestants. Bit by bit, Anne helped reshape not only Henry's heart, but also his mind. She became the catalyst for what would become the English Reformation. In 1533, after years of bitter conflict, Henry defied the Pope. He broke from the Catholic Church, declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, and married Anne in a secret ceremony. Soon after, she was crowned queen with a lavish coronation, the first and last of its kind for a common-born English queen. She was now Anne Boleyn, Queen of England. But the victory was not without consequence. Henry's break with Rome plunged England into religious turmoil. Monasteries were closed. Clergy were forced to swear loyalty to the king over the Pope. Those who resisted, including Sir Thomas More, were executed. Henry had risked everything for Anne. And now, she had to deliver what Catherine could not: a son. In September 1533, Anne gave birth to her first child, a girl. She named her Elizabeth. While Elizabeth would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, at the time, her birth was a bitter disappointment. The court had anticipated a prince. Henry had even prepared celebratory announcements with the word "Prince" already printed. They had to be altered after the fact. The king's frustration began to grow. Still, Anne remained confident. She believed she would bear more children, and that a son would come. She and Henry continued their marriage with passion and fury. It was not a gentle love, but a stormy, intense bond. Anne was known for her sharp tongue and jealousy, especially regarding Henry's wandering eye. Her enemies at court began to multiply. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, had once been an ally of Anne. But their visions for England differed. Anne wanted reform, but she also believed in charity and the protection of certain religious institutions. Cromwell, however, sought total destruction of the monasteries for wealth and power. Their relationship soured, and that made Anne vulnerable. The political climate turned increasingly hostile. Courtiers who had once supported Anne now whispered against her. Catherine of Aragon had died in 1536, removing the final barrier to Anne's legitimacy as queen. But that same year, Anne suffered a miscarriage, a boy, lost in the womb. For Henry, it was the final blow. Henry's love turned to coldness. He began courting Jane Seymour, a lady-in-waiting who was the complete opposite of Anne. Quiet, submissive, and politically neutral. At the same time, Cromwell, sensing the king's shifting mood, began plotting Anne's downfall. What had begun as a love story was now evolving into a tragedy. Anne's enemies knew that to destroy a queen, they would need more than gossip. They would need proof, or at least the illusion of it. The machinery of her destruction was being built quietly, ruthlessly. She had risen like no woman before her. But in the deadly world of Tudor politics, the higher one climbed, the farther they had to fall. As spring arrived in 1536, Anne Boleyn stood at a perilous crossroads. She had failed to produce a son. The king's affections had drifted, and her political influence had waned. Yet she remained unaware of the noose tightening around her neck. The court that once sang her praises now whispered only of scandal, treason, and death. The very forces Anne once wielded, ambition, charm, and conviction, were now turned against her. In the eyes of her enemies, she was not a queen, but a usurper, a seductress, a threat to the natural order. And in Henry's court, threats were eliminated, not tolerated. The stage was being set for one of the most shocking downfalls in English history. Anne Boleyn had changed a kingdom. But soon, that same kingdom would turn on her. And what awaited her would not be justice, but a show trial, an execution.